Order. I want to welcome all our guests and visitors here. I'm excited about this hearing. I think that I've had the chance to read the testimony last night, spoke with our witnesses a moment ago. We actually do read your testimony, and in this case it was quite rewarding. I can't say that for all the testimony we received, but this was most informative, very thoughtful, and very well prepared, and we're grateful for the time you put into it and the expertise you bring to the hearing and to your comments today. This is, as I've mentioned to you, is a friendly hearing and a friendly committee. We pride ourselves on bipartisanship. My ranking member, Vern Ehlers, will be here in just a moment. And so it's really, we look at this as an opportunity to learn from you what is being done that works well, what are problems, and what we can do better. The issues before us today are dealing with the status of visas and other policies for foreign students and scholars. Our subcommittee is going to focus on the role that the federal government can play in fostering international scientific cooperation and science diplomacy. As a scientist myself and as somebody who's been fortunate enough to travel a good bit, I think this is a critical element of our economic and, in fact, our defense security, making sure that people interact in a constructive way worldwide around issues of scientific and scholarly exchange is one of the best things we can do to foster understanding and prosperity around the world. I've come to believe that although we're not looked upon as highly as we once were in many respects, countries around the world still respect our leadership in science and technology, and they admire our openness to that, and the more we can embody that, the better. One of the ways we do this is by fostering collaborative research between scientists here domestically and foreign scientists. However, it can also be done by bringing foreign scientists to our country to study. And many scientists and engineers who enter the U.S. on student and scholarly visas return home and rise to prominent positions in their own countries and then serve as important advocates for our country. At the same time, as some of the testimony we're likely to hear shortly conveys, many of our own, in quotes, Nobel Prize winners have come from foreign countries, and many of the outstanding teachers and contributors to our economic development are originally of foreign origin. And we need to actually, I think, publicize that a great deal. While all of us on this committee, particularly Chairman Gordon and Dr. Ehlers, are committed to increasing the pipeline of U.S. students in science and engineering fields, we also recognize that this does not necessarily mean that we should turn away the best and brightest from other countries. Foreign students help broaden and enrich the educational experience of their peers. Foreign scholars bring different perspectives to their disciplines and to their American colleagues, often initiating new research directions that may lead to scientific or technological breakthroughs. Today we're going to look at the federal government's policies relating to foreign students and scholars at our education and research institutions. And it's been about 4 years since this committee last examined this. Happily, from the testimony we'll hear, there's been progress in that interim. And that was, of course, a fairly difficult time for this country, to say the least. And so the progress is gratifying, but also we'll hear today from constructive suggestions for improvement. The hearing will serve as the first in a series of hearings on scientific diplomacy. Just for the notification of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, on March 12th, Ambassador Tom Pickering and other distinguished leaders of the foreign policy and scientific communities will be providing an informal briefing, not in a formal hearing setting, but an informal briefing on the history of U.S. efforts in scientific diplomacy, what's been done, what's being done. Dr. Goodman has provided some very helpful comments in his testimony, as well as Dr. Fineberg and Dr. Cotten on this. On April 12th, current administration officials will participate in a hearing on current efforts within the U.S. government in this area and the opportunities for the future. And later in the year, we'll have a hearing with scientific organizations, private foundations, and representatives from foreign entities who are also involved in these efforts. So this is sort of the kickoff to one of the main predominant themes of this committee for this calendar year. Our universities and high-tech industries, as well as some of our prominent foreign policy leaders, have long recognized the value of scientific exchange, but it will take a sustained effort by all stakeholders to make scientific diplomacy a cornerstone of our foreign policy. I look forward to our subcommittee being part of that effort. In this regard, I recently had the privilege of flying leading a delegation of members of this committee down to Antarctica. There's a lot of flight time, I can tell you, when you fly to Antarctica, 65 hours in the air, and one of the DVDs that I took was a story of Senator Fulbright's life, and importance, just the extraordinary achievements of his contribution to this country, not only Fulbright scholarship, but many other ways. But that signature issue named after him has been of such benefit to not only the United States, but to the world, and I want to make sure we keep that kind of spirit alive and that this committee contributes. At this point, I would normally defer to Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Neugebauer, would you like to offer his commentary or that of your own? Or?
I think he's on his way, and I'll enter my own if that's all right, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Baird. And speaking of a very long flight, I had the privilege of accompanying the chairman, and it was a very interesting flight. But there was a lot of airplane time on that trip. Thank you, Chairman, and witnesses for appearing here today on this important subject. This issue is a small fraction, but no less critical than of that which is a dilemma that this country faces regarding immigration policy. We sit here today, our country remains strongly divided over who we should let in and from what country, and do we place a cap on certain skills, and what it will be the ultimate cost in dollars and opportunities beyond the American taxpayers. But we also know that this committee is a committee of good ideas, one that where we can all agree that science is a place in our public policy. I, for one, believe that public policy based on science and not emotion is the best policy. The concerns I have over this issue do involve the scientific community, and particularly the medical community. In my district, West Texas, like hundreds of other places, others in Congress, it's considered rural America. Today we face a problem that not just about the affordability of health care, but also how to access that health care. It was about 6 months ago when I was contacted by a very concerned constituent of mine who called not as one who needed better access to health care, but one who found she was struggling to provide it. Dr. Leah Ann Jenkins is a professor and chief of the Division of Cardiology at Texas Tech University School of Medicine located in my district. She approached me about her concerns regarding this issue, and upon my request, I asked that she put together her thoughts for me for today's hearing. And with the chairman's allowance, I would request unanimous consent to insert her statement into the record. Thank you. I'll not read that statement, but I will just give you a few points. Leanne states, insufficient numbers of required specialists on medical school faculties can limit the ability of the schools to provide quality education opportunities for residents and fellows and fulfill the clinical service expectations. Currently, the Conrad 30 program allows states to waive J-1 visas to satisfy service needs in medically underserved areas. By allowing these physicians to extend their stay in the U.S., medical care is provided to many patients who might otherwise not have access to this care. Currently, U.S. teaching hospitals comprise 1% of the nation's hospital, but render 55% of the indigent care provided. So I think she brings up some extremely interesting points about the ability of hospitals and medical schools to be able to have the appropriate staffing levels to be able to continue to turn out medical students. So these are medical students that not necessarily are foreign students, but these are foreign scientists and physicians in our universities that are helping us keep our medical schools accredited, and I think that's a very important point. And so as we move forward with this issue, Ms. Cotten, I appreciated in your statement, I think you acknowledged that we cannot know all that we have lost, the successes that we might have been. And clearly, 9/11 and the original issues of the World Trade Center in 1993, we found a need to look at the folks that are in our country and from where they came from, and those studying sciences, and to make sure that it is their interest is in sciences in the benefit of the U.S. But we also know that they can contribute to our country as well, and that not all people that come into this country illegally are trying to do harm. But the unfortunate thing is we do have to know why they're here and what they're doing. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is going to be an interesting discussion, and I thank you for calling this hearing today.
Thank you, Mr. Neugebauer. It was a pleasure to travel with you. A journey like that together. Again, we've been joined on the Democratic side by Mr. Carnahan and Mr. McNerney, Dr. McNerney here, and Ms. Bayless recognized for an open.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being delayed on the way over here. This is a very important issue, and I was struck Sunday after church was tackled by several of our church members precisely on this issue. But they were not talking about having scientists come here, but in one case it was musicians, in another case it was theologians. And the same principles apply, and so we should all recognize that. The international students and scholars are an important part of our science and technology economy and diplomacy. Whether U.S. scientists and engineers are traveling abroad or foreign scientists and engineers are coming here, the facilitation of global scientific exchange is necessary to overcome many of our global technology problems. In this flat world, we must indeed figure out a way to keep our country safe, but open it to those with no ill intent. Only a small fraction of international students and scholars receive the opportunity to study or teach in the United States. The lucky ones often leave behind spouses and children to pursue multi-year programs and appointments. In recent years, some students have avoided returning home for long periods of time because they fear possible delays and the maze of red tape associated with getting back into the U.S. Consequently, many of these students experience personal hardship and sacrifice to follow their dream of studying at one of our institutions. I think we are all aware of the impacts this can have on universities and scientific progress, but the human factor of this issue is often overlooked. I know many of our witnesses have been working on a solution to this problem. In the post-9/11 world, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State have worked diligently to ensure that students who pose no security risk to the U.S. can still attend our higher educational institutions. Nonetheless, the last 6 years have been challenging for both students, scholars, and the government to find a critical balance of interest. It is encouraging to see the numbers indicating that international student interest and attendance at U.S. universities has rebounded. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the progress and challenges still facing our visa system. Just want to add two more personal notes. The first, when I was a student at Berkeley, we were, as scientists throughout the country, were eager to get Russian scientists into our nation because they were very capable people, had much to contribute to our learning, and the Soviet government wouldn't let them go. And we thought it was horrible. Now it's reversed. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Russia allows their scientists to come here. We don't let them get in. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. Our country has gone 180 degrees on this. I also have a personal interest in this. My son, who is a scientist, married a scientist from Europe, and they are having incredible problems with the United States in terms of her coming here, her staying here, her going back to Germany for the summer as they're doing, and whether or not she can get back in. It's just horrendous, the hoops that anyone has to jump through. If we really want to attract scientists from other countries, we have to deal with these problems and deal with them properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. As always, very insightful comments, and the personal experience, I think, is one that if you're having that experience and your family members are, though we have made some progress in the numbers, I think that Mr. Edson will share with us, suggest improvements. Clearly, a few anecdotes like that will circulate rapidly, and what we won't see are the people who just don't even bother to apply and instead seek opportunities elsewhere. This committee has had hearings on the expansion of U.S. universities overseas. We're well aware that increasingly foreign scholars are finding opportunities in the EU, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Australia, etc. And whereas our country was once the destination perhaps most desired by scholars around the world, we are now, unfortunately, I think, not looked that way, not because our technological prowess is declined, but because it is just, frankly, oftentimes perceived to be a headache. Again, we're making progress there, but more progress is needed. As the tradition of this committee, if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses, and I will apologize in order that we hear more from you. We'll keep your resumes shorter than they deserve. You are all extraordinarily impressive individuals, and so the introductions will be rather brief. Mr. Stephen Tony Edson is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Visa Services in the Bureau of Consular Affairs at the Department of State. Dr. Harvey Fineberg is the President of the Institute of Medicine at the National Academies. Dr. Allan Goodman is President and CEO of the Institute of International Education, which actually oversees the aforementioned Fulbright program, is my understanding. And Ms. Catheryn Cotten is the Director of International Office at Duke University and has had personal dealings with, I don't know how many thousands, it sounded like from your testimony, of students dealing and scholars dealing with the very issues we'll hear from today. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions, and we'd like to start with Mr. Edson, and we appreciate again very much your time. Mr. Edson.
Thank you very much, Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the committee for allowing me the opportunity to give you an update on the status of the Department of State's visa procedures for foreign students and scholars. I'm happy to report that we're working diligently to streamline the process to attract the best and the brightest foreign students and scholars to the United States while maintaining the high security standards vital to protect this nation. The Department is aware of the particular interest this committee has had with regard to these applicants, and we appreciate your support in our efforts to improve and expand visa services for them. Foreign students contribute over $13 billion annually to the well-being of this country. Their work significantly boosts our academic and scientific research, and their exposure to our culture and freedoms is a crucial public diplomacy success. In FY 2007, we issued over 10% more student and exchange visitor visas than in the previous year, in 2006, and we surpassed 2001 levels for student and scholar visas by 16%. At some of our busiest posts, the number of student visas grew even more dramatically. For example, in China, the numbers were up 38% in Beijing and 51% in Guangzhou over FY 2006 totals. And in India, the largest source country for foreign students, student visa issuances in Mumbai increased by 55% and in Chennai by 34%. We're moving quickly to make our entire visa process more electronic through an online visa application process, an online appointment system, which 70 of our posts are currently using in its first form, and online fee payment. A fully electronic process will provide for more accurate and verifiable information, allow for fraud screening in advance of interview when it's necessary rather than afterwards, and increases convenience for applicants, allowing them to make arrangements from the United States before they travel, for example, and standardizing the process worldwide. We issued guidance in January of this year to allow consular officers to waive the visa interview for some categories of renewal applicants who have previously provided 10 fingerprints, been interviewed, and received visas. This is an authority authorized under the Intelligence Reform Act that we are finally able to take advantage of because of our 10 fingerprint collection process. Eligibility for the exception to interview includes student and exchange visitor visa applicants applying for the same program of study within 1 year of expiration of the previous visa, again, after the 10 prints have been collected. For the approximately 3% of our applicants who actually require additional review and clearance through the Washington agencies back here, that process now averages about 14 days for the visas mantis, which is the most common screening method that might be applied to students. And it is important to note that that interagency clearance process actually, although it garners, it has a lot of perception, it's perceived to be a major issue, it actually applies to a very small fraction of students and scholars around the world. The State Department continues to coordinate an annual interagency review of the Technology Alert List, which is the tool that drives that visas mantis screening process. And there was established 2 years ago a permanent Interagency Security Advisory Opinion Requirements Review Board, a mechanism that could formally look at that process and others on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're given the rigorous sort of continuous review and improvement that they deserve. Since September 2001, we've created 570 new consular officer positions around the world. It's about an 18% increase in our adjudication staff. We were able to work with our partners at DHS to increase to 120 days the amount of time before studies begin that a student can apply for a visa. Thus moving that summer rush period earlier into the late spring. And we do post and update visa appointment wait times on the Internet for all of our applicants. We provide expedited appointments for students in any event so that they are able to get their visas or get their interviews in time to attend the beginning of classes. We continue to look to the future, particularly efforts to further leverage technology and biometrics in the visa process to further improve security and facilitation for legitimate travelers. And I'm happy to discuss any of those initiatives, of course, that are of interest to the committee. We have shown steady increases in the number of students coming to the U.S. over the past several years through our efforts to work with the scientific and academic research communities to be as responsive as possible to their need while maintaining the integrity of the visa process. And we appreciate your continued interest in our work.
Dr. Fineberg.
Thank you very much, Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the committee. It's a pleasure for me to have the privilege to spend this time with you, and I want to use my oral testimony to supplement and reinforce the written testimony that I submitted previously. Just this morning, before coming over to the hearing, I had a meeting at our offices at the National Academies with a delegation from Croatia. The delegation was here in part because the Minister of Science, Education, and Sports, a great collection I thought, was invited by the President to attend the prayer breakfast this morning. And to him this was an enormous privilege, greatly appreciated. But what struck me was that this minister was an individual who was trained in Croatia, but had spent time as a student in the United States, had come back to spend some time on a faculty and to teach in the United States, and had taken back to his home, in the position of responsibility that he now has, the values and the lessons as well as the technologic expertise that he gained during his time in the United States. That is a story which is repeated for me personally scores of times every year, and it is repeated around the world literally thousands of times. The good that we are doing, not just for the world, but in the enlightened self-interest of the United States, in keeping our doors open to the kind of student, scientist, and scholar represented by this minister, is incalculably good, and I believe vastly overshadows the $13 billion of revenues that the students from overseas bring to the United States. It is imperative for our own interest that we maintain the opportunity for individuals around the world to spend this time in the United States, to gain not only their own professional knowledge, but to bring to us the benefit that they have in the ways that you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Ehlers both cited, as did Mr. Neugebauer in his opening remarks today. We've done a lot of things better than had been true years ago after 9/11, and the improvements that Mr. Edson recited are notable and laudable. In particular, I want to take special note of the point he made of the decision in January to authorize our consular officers to issue to renewal applicants who satisfy certain criteria a visa without the requirement for an interview. This is an important step forward, and it is an example of the kind of clear-headed, straightforward adjustments that we can make that will simultaneously keep our borders secure and open our doors to students and scholars from overseas. The challenge that we have is great because we need to focus our resources where the risks are highest and not have a uniform approach to every applicant from every corner of the world. And it's by using this kind of selective decision-making that we can do that. We should be doing more. For example, we should be able to find a way to domestically reissue student and exchange visitor visas for those who have remained here in the United States in status and are applying again for the same visa application. We ought not to require those individuals to leave the United States. It's hard for me to understand why they can be better assessed in Bulgaria than they can in Boston for their security interests of our country. We applaud the review of the technology alert list. We believe that that review also should be conducted with the engagement of outside scientists, engineers, and experts so that the department can take advantage of the best thinking of what really represents today a list of relevant expertise that ought to be carefully judged. And we also believe that some of our requirements should be explained more clearly to applicants and to our consular officers, particularly what is called Section 214B, a section that requires visitors to demonstrate that they do not intend to immigrate illegally. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions and to the discussion today.
I think you're right on the money. That's excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. We administer your Fulbright program on behalf of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the State Department. And I know Harriet Fulbright will be absolutely delighted when I tell her you watched the video 65 times. Since our founding in 1919, the Institute has done a census of international students in the United States and Americans going abroad. In the last half-century, there have been just two periods of decline, one in the early 1970s as a result of global recession and upheaval in Iran, and the second period in the wake of 9/11. As I highlight in my testimony, that period of decline is now over. Overall, last year, international students in America rose by 3%. New enrollments in our graduate and undergraduate programs increased by 10%. And in the science and engineering fields, new enrollments increased by 16%. Turning the corner took the hard work of everybody represented at this table and in this body and in the Senate. We were fortunate to have a very important tone set at the top by the President, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Homeland Security, the head of the Consular Service, Public Diplomacy, and the Assistant Secretary for Educational and Cultural Affairs. I think we're the only government in the world where so many top officials said in the wake of 9/11, we welcome international students. Mr. Edson talked about the heroic effort on behalf of increasing consular services. The Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs also made tremendous effort to get the word out through study abroad, through Education USA offices around the world, and to provide free advice so that students could access both the new procedures and opportunities for study here. International student advisors on all the major campuses reached out to international students, helped them with their both application and visa process, and a series of very strategic delegations were conducted by university and college presidents, by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Education to key sending countries to make the word clear that America really welcomes its international students. During International Ed Week, U.S. ambassadors in the key sending countries also spoke out and got a very important message across. We welcome international students. The market for international students and scholars is very sensitive to misperception abroad and very sensitive to mistreatment at home. In my statement and recommendations, I focused heavily on the Department of Homeland Security and the treatment that international students and scholars receive at our borders. As you said, Mr. Chairman, one anecdote circulates rapidly and widely and tarnishes an entire image. I also had a personal experience with the Department of Homeland Security returning from Saudi Arabia a few months ago. I was inspected at the border, and the first thing I was told was that Americans shouldn't go to Saudi Arabia. The second thing I was asked was what was my business there, and I mentioned international educational exchange and Fulbright, and the officer was skeptical that America should support international students coming here. Then he noticed in my passport that I'd been to Iran twice. And I said, no, actually I've been to Iraq twice to visit the United States ambassador and to help with the starting of the Fulbright program for Iraqis to come here. For the next 15 minutes, he turned every single page of my passport. The sweat started rolling down my sides, and I could imagine how an international student or scholar would feel just asked a series of questions or given an opinion. We've been training Foreign Service officers at the Foreign Service Institute since 9/11 on the value of international students and scholars to America. We have a similar proposal at no cost to the government to do that training for the Department of Homeland Security. And we believe if we could do that and they would accept the training, they would understand and appreciate, as this committee does and as our consuls do, that international students and scholars are the most closely vetted and screened and monitored group of any coming to the United States and are of, as my fellow witnesses all highlight, inestimable benefit to our progress in science and technology and also our commerce, something that Homeland Security is also designed to protect. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon, Chairman Baird and Ranking Member Allan and subcommittee members. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and speak with you on behalf of Duke University, the American Council on Education, and the Association of American Universities. Duke University Medical Center and Health System is a major teaching and research facility and a teaching hospital. We have approximately 1,800 international students, about 1,000 scholars, most of whom are involved in the sciences, although we do have a smattering of other areas as well. We use the F1 visa, the J1, the H1B, the O1, the TN, even the occasional R1 theology person to come to Duke and do research and study and teach. We cannot speak for all of the universities in the U.S., but we can certainly say that our issues are similar to other issues of universities and research facilities around the country. We've been asked to respond to 3 questions. We would refer you to our written testimony for the first 2, and we'll focus on the third, which has to do with the recommendations we would have for some changes that could be done now and that would not necessarily require statutory changes. We've already spoken among this group about stateside visa extensions and how important that would be to our people. We cannot overemphasize the fear that people have in returning home or outside the U.S. to get a new visa stamp. The first experience is often a very difficult one, even though it turns out fine in the end. It's very painful as far as the process goes, often requires travel from some distance to the local consular post. We have been very pleased with the advances that have been made in the last few years in giving F1 and J1 students the opportunity to have earlier appointments, in giving consular officers the permission to give them the benefit of the doubt to come into the country in terms of their non-immigrant intent. We'd like to look a little more at that area as well. But once they arrive here, they are very frightened to go back. They're afraid that this time they won't get the visa stamp. And so the discussion that we've had among the panelists here regarding stateside processing is one that would be of tremendous help to all of our international students and scholars. In addition, many of our researchers and our faculty, when they travel as part of the work that they do for us, need to travel short term. They go to a conference that's a 3-day or a 4-day conference. They really can't afford to spend 3 weeks. Even though they get expedited processing, it could take 2 or 3 weeks to get a visa to come back. And so they are choosing not to go to these important conferences, not to represent our institutions at these important meetings because of the fear of either taking too long to get back or not being able to come back at all. We know that stateside visa processing is possible. It's been done before. And we especially applaud the Department of State's efforts recently to waive the interviews for visa extensions and to go to the online filing system, which means that not only can you just print it out, but you can truly press the submit button and file online and have information go where it needs to go. With this kind of technology, there really is no point in forcing the body to be outside the country to get the visa stamp issued. And so we would encourage any efforts in the direction of stateside processing for visa extensions. And in conjunction with that, the non-immigrant intent issue and that discussion, it's an important law, but it's an old one. The non-immigrant intent is the assumption that anyone applying is an intending immigrant and they must prove otherwise. With our F1 and J1 students and scholars, they've already shown that they are worthy of coming to the U.S., or they wouldn't be getting the documents that we've given them. They will have gone through security clearances before they get their visa stamps. It's very difficult for them, for any student coming into an undergraduate or graduate program, to swear where they will be in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. Our own domestic students don't know that. Certainly the international students don't. And the issue of non-immigrant intent is one that we could deal with in terms of policy and looking at some bright line areas to define. For example, have these people filed for immigrant visas? Have they filed labor certs? Has anyone done anything to get them green cards? If not, can we not simply assume, barring any other major indications, that they have non-immigrant intent? We could do that without changing the law, although we would not be averse to some legislative changes as well. Another area that's caused some difficulty among the educational community and the research community is the exchange visitor program professor and researcher or research scholar category. The J1 program is one of the finest examples of international exchange that this country has ever produced, and it's been going on for over 50 years. And we've brought many thousands of international students and scholars in and out of the U.S. on that program. In particular, the professor and research scholar category is used by our educational institutions as the workhorse visa to move people in and out of the country and to move them around the country so that they can do all of the visiting lectures, the guest professorships, the collaborative research. For reasons that we don't understand, the exchange visitor program has given the professor-researcher category a 5-year limit, which we applaud, but only if that 5 years is continuous and uninterrupted. If we bring someone in for a year to teach for 1 year, to do research for 1 year, then that person is barred from returning in the J category, professor-researcher, for 2 years. If they come for 3 weeks, 2 days, 4 hours, and they come in the professor-researcher category, and they end that activity and go home, they are barred for 2 years from returning not just to our institution, but to any educational institution in America. We don't understand the philosophy behind this, and we would welcome the opportunity to have a more in-depth discussion of that particular characteristic of the J program. We'd also like to talk about the F1 student employment. We understand that Department of Homeland Security is considering giving F1 students optional practical training, not for 12 months, which is true now, but for up to 29 months. And we would certainly encourage that, to give particularly our postdoctoral students the opportunity to work longer in the U.S. in their postdoctoral training after they graduate. One of the difficulties, though, with the OPT is that it must be adjudicated by Homeland Security. Unlike the other student working options and the scholar working options, which we manage on the campus, this one in particular requires an adjudication. It is something that we could handle on the campuses through SEVIS, through a reporting system. We're doing that now with numbers of other kinds of work authorizations, and we could do this as well. We had students at Duke last year because of the July green card situation, which some of you may have heard of. Homeland Security got many hundreds of thousands of applications for green cards, and our students were filing their OPT work permissions after graduation or before graduation in anticipation of working for the summer. Those applications sat in storage facilities in Homeland Security for months. They were not only not adjudicated, they were not opened, the checks were not cashed. It was as if they did not exist. There is a regulation in Homeland Security that if they take more than 90 days to issue a work permission, that a person should be able to walk into a local office and get interim work permission. Homeland Security announced that it had elected not to follow its regulation in that regard. We had numbers of students who lost jobs, who had filed months in advance. These were not students who waited till the last minute. They had filed properly, and they lost jobs because they could not say to an employer when they would be able to start, couldn't even track their application because it had never been opened and a number assigned to it to track. So we would encourage the Homeland Security involve the educational programs and the institutions more in the, not adjudication of, but merely approval of optional practical training.
Ms. Cotten, I'm going to ask you to wrap up here. Your testimony is absolutely valuable, and the comments I read are, I think, spot on. But I want to make sure there's time for give and take here. So
I'll be happy to close there. Thank you,
all right,
sir.
great. Thank you. Very, very excellent presentations on all parts. I'm cognizant that I should address the issue. We extended an invitation to DHS to participate, and apparently they were unable to. Their witnesses, the people who would most likely have been participating today on the panel, were unavailable. Dr. Ehlers and I were just chatting about the need to bring them in at some point, not necessarily even in a formal setting such as this, but perhaps some integrated effort between DHS and ICE and state and others to address these issues, because I'm not sure the coordination there is what it needs to be. Dr. Goodman, you certainly look like a suspicious and dangerous individual, so I can perfectly understand why they shook you down the way they did. But, I mean, somebody else, a more upstanding individual, shouldn't have to undergo what you did. I actually know of a state legislator who was threatened with being sent to Guantanamo. And so that's not just scholars, but the point you made about scholars, impression that gains, and it's your first impression. You come here with great enthusiasm and energy and excited, and you've worked your whole life. And as many of you know, the conditions under which some of the folks who work their way to come to the United States, the opportunities that they had to just carve out a scratch sometimes to get where they got, to come here, and then the shining city on the hill, the first impression is, we don't even want you here, pal, is not particularly welcoming. So we intend to follow up on that, and the point was well taken, and your personal example is quite valuable. I'm also cognizant that I don't want this, Mr. Edson, to be a kind of a, okay, these folks say this, why don't you do that? It'd be easy to devolve into that. But let me summarize the things that really stand out for me, that were consistent across the testimony. And if you want to comment on that, that's fine. I think what I might want to do is say, at some point, let's try to have a meeting with state and figure out what we can do about some of these, because these are things that I've been an academic before being in this job, and I certainly saw it, and I travel a bunch and periodically, as Vern and many members do, we get notices from our constituents, please help this person get into this conference, and maybe we get on the phone and it becomes tedious. I should mention we've been joined by Dr. Bartlett from Maryland as well. Roscoe, I'm sorry I didn't catch you there earlier. These are some of the things that seem to be, to me, common sense, not particularly dangerous to our country by any means, and imminently doable. And let me just list some of these that I either heard or read. The issue repeatedly mentioned of the local, domestic here extension of the visas makes an awful lot of sense to me. And maybe there are reasons to not do that, but it certainly, if there are such reasons, they elude me. A second one has to do with this exchange visitor program and the 2-year bar. Just the nature of it. We want to promote international travel, international exchange, and to say to somebody, we want you to collaborate with U.S. scientists and your home scientists, your home institution, but by golly, if you go back there to even see if your lab's collecting dust, don't expect to come back into the U.S. for 2 years, really is a bar. It's a bar to effective research, especially since increasingly our research enterprise is an international, global operation. It may be a flat Earth, but apparently you can fall off of it if you leave our country for a little bit, and that shouldn't be the case. So, I understand this from my reading that the intent is to make sure that there's an allowance for new blood, so to speak, to come into the exchange visitor program. But it's not like academics or scholars are interchangeable. You don't just plug and play. Okay, so we got one scholar here, she's gone, here's another one. This person may happen to be one of the world's experts in a visual system or in cancer or in neutrino discovery or whatever. We need them to be able to go back and forth. So I really, for the life of me, don't see why that exists and why we can't fix it. And my understanding, I think, is that could be an administrative fix rather than statutory. If it requires statutory, let us know. Another thing that I know is a real challenge for international scholars is this issue of work. I quite literally wrote the book on internships in the social sciences, and I believe that getting people out of the classroom into a work environment is conducive to our economic enterprise, but also there's just no substitute for being in business and getting your hands dirty and doing stuff. And time and time again, we see international scholars stymied because they're not allowed to work. And we're not talking about taking jobs from Americans here. We're talking about maybe a postdoc in neurobiology going into a clinic and doing some work that is synergistic. They're getting the hands-on skill and the clinic's getting their services. So adjusting that work issue really ought to be something we explore. And the same is true, actually, not just at the postdoc or doctorate level. It's also true for many of our undergraduates who I think could perform quite well and benefit from it. And finally, I understand the immigration intent challenge, but my understanding of the literature on lie detection devices is that it is not particularly empirically sound, and we're asking for a more primitive assessment itself. I was tempted to ask Ms. Cotten if she intends to steal the water bottle from the dais there or not, and to prove to me that she had no such intent, and what evidentiary basis she would use to prove that she has no intent to steal the water bottle would be perhaps a fair analogy for what some of these folks face. So those are the things that strike me, and I know there are others as well, but I'll give you a chance to just address any of those you want, Mr. Edson, and then. But again, don't feel like you have to solve them all. You're not in a position to do that, and I don't want it to just all be. If you could, though, this would be one successful hearing. We'd put a letter on the calendar.
Thank you for that tremendous opportunity to solve the problems of the world. If the committee has time, a meeting to discuss particularly the J1 and the work issues with our colleagues from ECA, the Education and Cultural Programs, and from DHS, that would be very valuable, I think, because that's a beyond what the Bureau of Consular Affairs does. On the stateside revalidation, that's an issue we've looked at very carefully, and for a long time. We actually never did students in the United States. For several years, business people in certain categories, skilled workers in the H-1B program, were able to extend their visas in the United States. After 9/11, when the statutory requirement for biometric collection was imposed, that happened at the same time when our own Inspector General had directed us to close the program anyway due to concerns about fraud and our inability to effectively fight fraud. Perhaps oversimplifying a little bit, but I think part of the concern was when an applicant is submitting an application like that, you have no choice to call them in for interview, so you have to tell them to go abroad to complete the application. That immediately tips them off that there is a problem, and they'll just stay in the United States and never actually complete the application. So working around that was something that we and our Inspector General were both concerned about. We did stop the program in July or August of 2004, I believe, and have discussed it quite a bit with the business community since that was what pre-existed, extensions of it, and continue those discussions now. We still have the same security concerns. We have more flexibility in biometrics now that we're collecting tin prints and collecting it in a way that enables us to. We use the word recycle internally, but it's not quite right. But it enables us to attach one set of prints to multiple applications from the same applicant, and so use that data more intelligently, I think, for the future. So it's an issue of ongoing discussion and interest, I think, on all sides, and we would welcome continued discussion. 214B, as you know, most of the non-immigrant visas that are denied around the world are denied for this reason, because the applicant appears to be an intending immigrant. The refusal rate has actually declined ever so slightly since 9/11, particularly for students. It's declined a little more for students than it declined for the rest of the world. So about 80% of students are approved for visas now, and the rate is, because of the way our data is collected, this is anecdotal, but the rate certainly seems to be much higher for students in graduate and postgraduate areas, students or scholars. We have been concerned about bright line tests for the opposite reason than was discussed before. We're concerned that we might deny an opportunity for an applicant to come to the United States who doesn't meet some fairly standard-looking test. I mean, every day we're going to issue visas to fairly poor young single people who've never been out of their country of nationality before. That's a sort of a tourist visa example, but that happens every day, and we are cognizant of the need to structure whatever guidance we provide on 214B, so it's not only in keeping with the statutory framework, but doesn't create additional problems. It is a screen for again, I'm stumbling with phrases here, but perhaps what you might call non-serious students. It would not be right to assume that we're not making proper visa decisions at most of the time. I think there are a number of students who come in to see us and have no clue what they'll be studying, don't speak English, even though the I-20 may indicate that they did. And those sorts of students are being screened out with the 214B. So there's a value in that part of the law that we'd have to look to replacing somehow if it were in additional enforcement actions by ICE or something. But it's a relatively inexpensive and hard to explain but easy to implement tool for that purpose, if that is the continued will of Congress.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really kind of amusing, but also sad. Some years ago, I spent a year in a research program in Germany, and since I was going to be there more than a year, I had to go down to the Ausländeramt, which is a foreign office, and register and so forth. And I sat there, and I waited in line for about 2 hours to get a form to fill out. Then after that, I had to go back to the line to hand in the form. And so I spent 4 hours. When I got back to the institute where I was, my German colleagues were absolutely horrified that I had been subjected to this. Said, "Why didn't you tell me you're a professor?" I says, "Well, in America, it doesn't make any difference." And they said, "Well, in Germany, it does." But at any rate, after going through that very, very bureaucratic process, incredibly bureaucratic, I thought, good grief, thank goodness for the good old USA, where we don't have this sort of thing. And now we find the tables reversed. We've gotten as bad, if not worse, than many other countries. And I think part of it in dealing with this issue, and that's why I think the idea proposed that we get together informally. It's a three-headed monster. It's the state, it's Department of Homeland Security, and Citizenship and Immigration Services, CIS. I do have to say, Mr. Edson, you're probably the least bad in this situation. Well, that's intended as a compliment. The others need even more work than you do. One concern I have, and I've visited a number of foreign embassies. I've talked to the consular officials. They have a horrible task to try to decide who should go in, who should not. But I think there are some problems there. A case that we're working on now, this was a religious music conference in my home city at the headquarters of a denomination which is in my city. And quite a number of foreigners were not allowed. In fact, one case, some 15 of them who were active in the music service of their particular churches took a train considerable distance to get to the consular offices and watched the consular official not even open their applications or the portfolios, just went right down the line, stamped no, 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 no on all of them, and sent them on their way. And they never had a chance to speak. Their portfolios weren't open. And that's unacceptable behavior. One thing that's really bothered me over the years is the impossible appeal process of people who are denied. Frequently in a situation, people obviously call us and say, "Can you help?" We always tell them, well, some things we can do, some we can't. But a consular official, I would think that a letter from a member of Congress who personally knows the people organizing the conference and has asked them about the people coming and was there any possibility that they would be inappropriate. And we send a letter to the consular official and it's totally ignored. And the review, there is no review. It's the same official who denied it is the one who reviewed it. There's something wrong with that process. There has to be a reasonable appeal process. And I don't mean just for members of Congress, but I mean for anyone who wants to appeal and go to someone else. And I really think you have to re-examine that. Your purpose is not to keep people out. Your purpose is to welcome the good people and keep the bad people out. And I think far too many good people are prevented from coming here for perfectly legitimate reasons, whether academic or otherwise. So I urge you to really re-examine that carefully. Maybe you need more consular officials. I know they're overworked. I talked to one once and asked, could she specifically say what her job was, and she said, I say no all day long. When she gets to work in the morning, there's a line stretching about a block long, people trying to get in to see her, and she has to process all those people all day long. And it's very difficult. You may need some more people on that as well. The one thing I do want to commend the State Department on, by the way, is the way you handled the passport crisis last year, which has nothing to do with this. But we had one person in our office working full-time, constantly, every day with the people who came to us because they were waiting for their passport, they had paid for their cruise, etc. And your department did yeoman's work in trying to accommodate people. I can remember only a couple who could not take the trip because it didn't arrive in time. Many of them had heart attacks waiting for it because it usually arrived 2 days ahead of time. But you did yeoman work in that, and something that was imposed on you from the outside by the Congress, and just took you time to catch up with it. So I do appreciate what the State Department did on that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will pass.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you. I want to commend the chairman and ranking member for really bringing this before the subcommittee. It really is essential, I think, to get the best and the brightest minds here, no matter where they're coming from. We should be a brain magnet to help keep us on the cutting edge of science and innovation. That's greatly in our country's interest, and the collaborative value of our scientists traveling to other parts of the world and scientists from other parts of the world coming here is just invaluable. And I would echo the comments that were made earlier about the value of those foreign visitors. Time and time again, we see foreign leaders, whether it's a prime minister or a member of parliament or a key business person who has had an education or exposure here. They can be some of our most powerful spokesmen and allies in terms of improving relations. It is an invaluable tool for our foreign policy as well as just our practical science and innovation and advancements. I'm a vice chair on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the International Organizations and Human Rights Subcommittee, and we had a series of hearings about America's image around the world. And the bad news is, in about a half a century of polling, we're at the lowest ever in terms of our image. The good news is, there's this great reservoir of feeling that the ideals of America are something that people aspire to. Freedom, human rights, international cooperation. I mean, so there's this great reservoir that we can tap into, but I think having this scientific exchange, educational exchange is vital to that, and I really applaud the efforts of trying to get the right parties around the table to see what we can do about this, and to the extent we need to involve our Foreign Affairs Committee in that, I would certainly like to offer their assistance as well.
Thank you, Mr. Carnahan. I think we'll definitely take you up on that, and your dual committee assignments will be tremendously in that regard, because as we mentioned, some of these changes can be just done administratively. Others may require statutory changes, and we'll probably try to look for part also who's on the Homeland Security. We'll even try to rustle up an appropriator or two, because that always helps. Well, it usually helps. Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. I understand that China produces several times as many engineers a year as our country does. That is true? I've heard about 6 times as many. Is that true? Is that also true of science, the physical sciences? Do they turn out a lot more physical scientists than we do also? I also understand that there are many companies in our country that have a very difficult time finding these technical people, scientists and engineers, and that if they can't find them in our country, they will move their company to where these skills exist. Is that also your understanding? Well, with these realities, I'm having a little trouble understanding why we are really concerned that these scientists and engineers might not go back home. I understand we don't want illegal aliens here, but the one group that come here that I would be less concerned about than most other groups, whether they went home or not, would be those groups where we have an acute shortage in our country. Wouldn't you think so?
Yes, sir.
Now, I know the State Department is handed the responsibility of making sure that the people who come here are likely to go home, but wouldn't you agree, Mr. Edson, that the problems of these people overstaying their visas are probably less than the problems of most other immigrants overstaying their visas? I'm having a hard time understanding why we're hassling these people after they get here. Because, you know, most of these skills we desperately need in this country. You cannot, for very long, contend with a country that is producing 6 times as many engineers and scientists as you're producing. And by the way, what % of our engineers are Chinese? As I look at our graduate schools, some of them it's somewhere near 50%, isn't it? And they're going home, I guess, some of them. So it's more than the 6-to-1 ratio. It's maybe 9-10-to-1 ratio. They're producing that many more engineers, and we could presumably the Chinese engineers in this country are going back to China. So I'm having some trouble understanding why we hassle these people. That would be the least problem if they overstayed their visa. Can you help me understand why I'm wrong?
I have kind of a simple role in the process because we implement the law. The H-1B, the skilled worker category, was exempted from the residence abroad requirement by Congress, but the students are required to prove that they intend to return home. And so we do ask those types of questions during the interview.
I understand you need to do that, but, hassling them after they're here, I'm having some trouble understanding.
I hassle them overseas.
Since we desperately need them for... Sir?
No, I'm just saying I hassle them overseas. DHS hassles
you
them
hassle
after
them both
the
places.
fair.
Well, I have a problem with hassling them at all, since we desperately need these skills in our country. I understand that you're charged with the responsibility of implementing the law, and the law is you're supposed to ask them, are you going home? And you're not supposed to let those come here that you have a fair suspicion are not going to go back home after their stay here. But don't you think it's rational that we treat these people in a dignified fashion?
Certainly, and we strive to do that. We train our officers to do that. We're moving them through fairly quickly because we're trying to get to everybody that wants a visa to the United States. But China is a good example. Over 80% of those students, or about 80% of those students, will qualify for visas and come into the United States. So they're meeting that test.
As other countries improve the quality of their secondary education, do we have a smaller percentage of students seeking to come to our country, or are we still the mecca for higher education, particularly in technical areas? Yes, Dr. Goodman.
Thank you, Congressman. We are the world's leading destination for students studying outside their country. Our market share has declined in the course of a decade from about 40% to 22%, but the pie has grown substantially over the course of the decade. I think we will continue to be the major destination, partly because no other country on earth has the capacity that America has to absorb international students. We have 582,000 last year here in the United States. They study at just 150 schools, half of them do. We have nearly 4,000 accredited colleges and universities, so we have a much greater capacity to expand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Dr. McNerney, as an engineer mathematician, you have long interest in this, and I welcome your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the committee members, or the panel members, for testifying today. You know, the issue is a difficult one and is complicated by the sort of emotional issues surrounding the entire immigration debate, which taints every single aspect of that, whether it should or not. Mr. Fineberg, thank you for coming in today, Dr. Fineberg. In your testimony, you suggest that the U.S. should not necessarily interview every single applicant, but should use its resources on the applicants that actually pose some sort of a threat. Do you have any specific objective criteria in mind when you say that, or are you... Yeah, let's leave it at that.
Well, already we heard from Mr. Edson, I thought, a useful starting point for this, namely those applicants who are repeating an application for the same type of visa as previously held, and for whom we have already adequate biodocumentation, in this case 10 fingerprints. Already the department has placed into a category where it will not be necessary to re-interview. I would submit that many of the categories we've been talking about in terms of scientific, scholarly roles that people play would put them in a lower risk category. And my general purpose in making that comment, if I may just say, is that I believe that if we attempt to apply the same intensity of attention to all applicants, we will not be deploying our available resources to screen out the high-risk applicants in an optimal way. We would be better served in terms of our security interests if we could concentrate where the risks are higher and allow more of the facilitation of visit for those where the risks are truly de minimis.
Well, what mechanisms are already in place to verify that the students and scientists are following the terms of their visa, and are those mechanisms sufficient to give comfort to the DHS?
I can't answer that question from my own knowledge, sir. I think we probably would want to hear from DHS about that, and maybe Mr. Edson has information that would be relevant to it.
Thank you. The primary change of benefit to our consular officers in the field is the Student Exchange Visitor Information System, the consolidated online system for registering and tracking foreign students in the United States, because it does enable, the data is input primarily by the educational institutions and enables our officers to verify that a student is in valid status at the time they apply for renewal. In fact, this is speculative, but I believe that it's possible that that decrease in the refusal rates for students that I mentioned might be tied in large part to the SEVIS program that provides such good data and basically eliminated improperly completed I-20s, the form that is required for a student visa, or fraudulent I-20s.
Well, to the extent that you can say today, how many documented incidents are there of foreign students or scholars entering this country and then taking actions to harm us, or going home and taking actions to harm us? Are there any documented cases, or how many?
I don't have that data. That would be data from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Ms. Cotten, how have the visa delays and denials affected the ability of your university to recruit the top scientists and engineers that you'd like to recruit?
I can tell you that we would normally recruit first because our people are going to international conferences. They are recruiting out of the graduate programs where we have a lot of international students coming through our own programs. And the difficulty we have is once we've identified them, can they get here? And so I can't say that we have a 50% failure rate or an 80% failure or 20, but there are always those people that either can't come. Every year we have people who are identified to come in research projects, and for whatever reason they cannot get their visa. Normally it's a 214B non-immigrant intent issue, or it takes so long that they just give up. And everybody says, oh, this is too much trouble. I've got a grant. I have to go forward with the grant. I have to find somebody else to fill that slot. So it's not numbers so much as it is identified individuals who are unique, who know just what they know and it's special, and we may not be able to get them. And if I could speak to your earlier question regarding how we're tracking or managing students when they're here, Mr. Edson mentioned the SEVIS system, and as an educational institution involved in the SEVIS system, we are required every semester to report on every international student that they are enrolled and moving forward in a full-time program. And for all of our scholars, the J1 scholars, we report when they arrive, and then we report specifically if we authorize them to give a lecture at another school, to do research at a local university or beyond. Any of those actions that would normally be work actions or changes in their activities, we report as those occur, and we put that information into SEVIS.
So a lot of the responsibilities falling to the university. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I know Dr. Ayers has to leave shortly, and I may have an amendment on the floor to address. Dr. Bartlett, can you stay for a few extra minutes here? One last set of questions, really. So some progress is being made. More progress needs to be made. But because of the kind of anecdotal occurrences that happen, there exists this bad impression in some ways in the international community. One of my questions would be, what is being done? I think, Dr. Goodman, you may have mentioned some of this in your written testimony. What's being done on the positive, proactive side to publicize that there's this nice phrase, I think maybe in Ms. Cotten's testimony, that borders closed but the doors are open, and in a positive sense, meaning if you can come, you can't just walk across the border, but to basically get the word out that we're doing a better job, and that you have a reason to believe you might be treated better, and what's being done to do that, or what should we do to create that. And then finally, after that question's addressed, if anybody has any remaining comments that feel are absolutely essential before we draw the hearing to a close, I'd welcome those. And also, I'll give Dr. Bartlett and Ernie a chance as well.
Mr. Chairman, I think you would be really delighted when ECA has the chance to meet with you, given the outreach that they have tried abroad, given the great expansion of both the website and the Foreign Student Advising Network that they've encouraged abroad, and also the results of the president delegations that they have taken abroad to the key sending countries. More than anything else, those activities, the universities in partnership with the government, saying that our doors are open and we welcome international students, is vital, and it's having an effect. Also, in those key markets where the ambassador sees in the press the anecdote and is able to then say, in reality, the visa issuance rates are X, we're open extra hours, students are at the head of the line, and to aggressively go after that at any point in time is really just critical. And we have to do that every day, because every day there will be that anecdote or that incident. With respect to your second question, I did want to suggest that we track also the flow of students, as Bartlett was asking, around the world, not just to and from the United States. I have been struck in the past 2 years at the number of countries, more than a dozen now, that have created special green cards or fast track to green cards for the critical skills people. If you get a PhD or an MD or whatever that we need in our country, as soon as you finish, you can stay and you can immediately move to either long-term residency status or the equivalent of 2 to 4 years staying. And so, as you asked me about the market we're competing for and our market share, we are also competing against those countries that, by legislative fiat, are saying critical skills people can stay and become permanent residents or citizens.
It's an excellent point. We really need to look at that. Unfortunately, the demagoguery that exists around the immigration issue right now sometimes obscures the legitimate issue that if we have a need for qualified, high-level people to work here, and we don't allow those people to work here, they will go offshore. And industries will take their business offshore and their capital offshore, and all the spin-off jobs these create. I can't remember whose testimony it was. I think it was actually maybe yours, Dr. Goodman, that the extraordinary number of Nobel laureates I alluded to earlier, but also many of the major businesses and developments of the last century that made all of our lives better came from foreign-born scholars who trained here and stayed here and created entrepreneurial enterprises. And what a terrible loss it is for all of us if we force those folks to leave. We also have some rather ironic barriers. For example, if even 1% of your company, if you have a startup with international non-U.S. citizens, even though they're living here, trained here, if your startup has a non-U.S. citizen as one of the startup owners of the company, you may be restricted, for example, in terms of what you can apply for in terms of U.S. Business development assistance. It's rather silly, actually, and so we ought to look at those kinds of things. And this committee, maybe it was Dr. Bartlett, won't put words in your mouth. Someone on this committee suggested once that there should be a green card stapled to every PhD in engineering granted in this country. Some variation of that may have some merit. Any other comments before my time is closed that people want to make that haven't had a chance to? I'll also give Dr. McNerney, and then, or actually Dr. Bartlett, then Dr. McNerney a last round here.
If I could, to complement what Dr. Goodman said about the public diplomacy, you know, Secretary Rice has a personal and professional interest in higher education and has made a personal commitment to make it easier for international scholars and students to get here. In addition to the formal programs that ECA has done, many of them broad, some of them targeted in very creative and unusual new ways for us. The consular sections abroad, we do get them involved because anytime there's bad information, it makes our life harder. In addition to making it harder for the United States to get these people in here, it makes the entire visa process harder. So our officers participate in web chats, speak to student groups. The Assistant Secretary, my boss, Maura Hardy, travels a great deal of the time and always speaks to university groups when she travels to try to break down some of the poor information.
Yeah, I think that's very admirable. And I should also note, historically, some of the adverse impressions of our country it did not just start 6 or 7 years ago or post 9/11. There were things like the closing of the international libraries, U.S. libraries internationally, happened before this administration's watch. It happened back early 90s. And I think that kind of activity, that was the beginning of an adverse impression of the U.S., and has harmed us in ways we don't fully appreciate. Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you. There's a clause in the Lord's Prayer that guides me in much of what I do. It's that clause that asks the Lord not to lead us into temptation, or to deliver us from temptation, depending upon the version that you're reading. Like, it's probably not fair to ask the goat to go to the cabbage patch because he has a conflicting interest. His interest to be responsive to your wishes and the temptation that the cabbage offers him. I say that because I don't want to be accused of profiling in what I say next. But I would suggest that there is a big difference between a student coming here from Iran or North Korea, and I hope they come from North Korea, by the way, or a student coming from Australia or Canada or England. Referencing that clause in the Lord's Prayer, I just think that it's very unfair to put these students from countries like and maybe China for the future, or Iran or North Korea, in a situation where they have conflicting loyalties. So I'm asking, do we treat students coming from countries like Australia, England, or Canada differently than we do students coming from these other countries? You see, from a national security, from a national interest perspective, I don't care whether those students from Australia, Canada, and England go home or not. I am concerned about the students, and because of my concern that we should not unfairly put people in compromising situations where they have conflicting loyalties, I just don't think it's fair, okay? It's not profiling. I just don't think it's fair. I'm really concerned about the students from these other countries where if they stayed and got a job where there was some knowledge that with a national security interest that they would, it's not fair to them. Are we treating these students differently? I hope we are.
In the visa process, yes. The students from countries that are state sponsors of terrorism, we're required by law to send them back to Washington.
But China's not one of those, are they?
China's not one of those, but China is targeted under the Mantis program.
Don't you think that this student from China is put in a compromising situation? These are people with an enormously proud heritage. When my ancestors were barbarians running around the continent of Europe and the British Isles, they had a really advanced civilization in China. Don't you think it's unfair to put them in a situation where there's a conflict of interest, even if they are not the sponsor of terrorism? Just as a human consideration, unfair to put them in that situation.
We are aware that their government poses particular challenges in certain security areas, and they're vetted in that way in the visa process. I can't speak to the end of the process when they're in the United States, which is a DHS function.
Yeah, I'm concerned about our national security. I'm even more concerned that we treat people fairly, and I think putting a person in a situation where they have conflicting interests is unfair, not the right thing to do. So I would hope that this is a part of our policy when we are admitting these students and watching them after they're here and determining whether they can return promptly or not. Wouldn't you think? And if we don't have different rules, either written or unwritten, that we play by, don't you think we should?
Again, in the visa process, we do screen. China is one of those countries that is of targeted interest for issues related to sensitive technology. And so we do screen them in a different way in the visa process when they're overseas.
Well, with our acute and growing need for more people in these technical areas, I would hope that our immigration policies could be helping to help solve this problem rather than impeding the solution of the problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bartlett, thank you. Dr. McNerney, any other comments or questions?
Thank you very much. Again, this has been a very important hearing, and I think we need to continue this sort of discussion. Having gone through the rigors of a PhD program, I understand how important it is to have visiting scholars. They contribute in ways that go beyond what you're studying, and they open up doors for you to go overseas, and so on and so forth. So I want to make sure that we do open those up. And I think some prior discussions with Chairman Baird, there's some very specific recommendations that would be helpful and that could turn into legislation. I hope to work with the chairman on that. You've actually elaborated on those, a couple of things. And also we need to take into consideration our national security, both in terms of whatever terrorist threat there may be, but with the economics and the globalization. So we have a number of things to balance here, and this is the type of discussion that's going to help open up that type of thinking that allows us to move forward on a general basis with these sort of things. So thank you very much for your time and your work, and with that I'll yield.
Thank you very much. I'll just close with a brief anecdote from my experience as a professor. I was privileged one evening to join a number of the Honor Society inductees at my university, and they asked the students to comment on what was the single most important aspect of their academic experience. This was at Pacific Lutheran University, where I used to chair a department. And there were maybe 45 or so young people there, and the intriguing thing was that every single one, virtually, maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, listed study abroad. And it became such that it was so repetitive. You know, the next one would get up, my time studying abroad. And I say that because what a tragedy it would be. We tend to think that, well, we're just keeping out potential dangers to our country. But if other countries reciprocate, and the ability of our young people to study abroad, which is the opposite direction than what we've talked about today, but equally important, if they feel harassed or unsafe or unwelcome, we too will lose what for the very brightest students, the top cream of the crop at our institution, wasn't the class they took from Dr. Baird, not surprisingly. It was their opportunity to travel and learn from a different culture. And that, we don't want to lose that for our students, and we certainly don't want to lose that for other students, and we desperately don't want to lose that for other scholars. So your testimony and comments today are tremendously helpful to us, and I want you to know that I am personally committed to this, as is Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Ehlers and Dr. McNerney and the rest of this committee, and we will follow up. We will work together, perhaps in a less formal setting, to see what can be done, again, with the aforementioned agencies, et cetera, and hopefully make further progress beyond what has already been made. These things don't happen overnight, but we are committed to establishing that, and I feel good because I have a sense that as I travel internationally and meet with other people, I can both acknowledge some of the frustrations of the past, but share with them the positive gains that have been made and the commitment that I'm hearing today to make further gains. So I'm grateful for your testimony and your leadership on this. Thank my colleagues on the committee, our committee staff, for putting forward and together such a great hearing. And with that, this committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.